Hello, everyone. My name is Rocky Hanish. I'm a professor at ASU, and I work in architecture at an architectural resource team here in Phoenix, Arizona. I practiced architecture in the Valley for about 10 years in Phoenix here, and been an educator for about 4 years.
I, I'm John Parman. I was a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in architecture until 2023. Now I'm directing. I have a think tank that I started with Professor Richard Bender in 1989. That's my research vehicle. And I live and work in Berkeley, California.
And today, John and I will be asking each other a couple questions regarding urban morphology as related to the idea of urban acupuncture and various topics, and we'll make this more conversational as we move through it. So, John, I'll start with the first question to you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Why is urban morphology relevant again?
Well, I think if you look at the efforts to make urban morphology uh, effective in the world, you can see that there's a big emphasis on method, right? How to do it. On all of those efforts, Giancarlo De Carlo, Jaime Lerner, Mike Leiden, and Anthony Garcia, all those methods, which are pretty well documented, are models, I think, for how to apply urban morphology. But they also progressively simplified urban morphology and kind of lost, especially tactical urbanism, lost a connection to a bigger picture about the context. And I think that urban morphology, uh, as a theory, it correctly grasped that the context really is important and that every place has a deeper context than people realize in the present moment. So, for example, Phoenix has a whole man-made man-made water system, but that water system builds on a very ancient irrigation system that actually made the whole valley work from a water perspective. Uh, so those kinds of issues are always there, and urban morphology is designed to unearth them. But it's a pretty cumbersome uh, process, and I think that Dr. Hassani and I, when we were starting to look at urban acupuncture in particular, we we realized that artificial intelligence might be the key, and computationally souped up. Sorry, that's a vernacular word. Computationally sped up data analysis also has the possibility of automating the process and also providing a memory, deeper memory, more accessible memory,
Yeah,
which all of which makes urban morphology actually possible.
and I think that's also rooted to a deep understanding of place in an interesting way. And so, as we begin to think about comparing, the largest city in Central Asia with the city in the Sonoran Desert, John, maybe we could discuss kind of place through that lens of comparison, comparative analysis.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, it's interesting because we've been looking at comparatively. I mean, Dr. Asani's research on urban acupuncture was originally focused on Rome, but we broadened it and pulled Phoenix in because Phoenix is a desert metropolis and it's closer to the Persian cities that Dr. Hassani has studied. But also we noticed that Tashkent, for example, has characteristics that it's sort of like a smaller version of Phoenix. Phoenix is a very large region. Tashkent is a little more compact, but they have the same kind of issues. They have this. They have a river that figures in their future, et cetera. So they have. I think desert urbanism is also a theme for us.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, it's a really interesting thing, excuse me, to think about urban morphology as related to a newer city like Phoenix, which why maybe this is an interesting place to test out, ideas related to urban acupuncture or thinking about broad systems and networks in terms of larger pieces of infrastructure, or whether those be information networks or however you want to kind of think about, that the central issue of how our cities evolve, right? Through thinking locally, thinking from the existing systems and governments and institutions and things that exist in a place, and how that starts to change and adapt to a changing climate and a changing need for adapting our cities to be more resilient.
right. It's interesting. Dr. Hassani's dissertation and a lot of her research has focused on how post-war modernism, modern planning, came into conflict with very, very old traditional ideas about what the city was supposed to be. And I think that that's also true in a place like Phoenix, right? That there's an overlay of kind of new ideas from different generations, because now it's like more than two generations since the end of World War II, almost three actually. So that collision of values and patterns is a theme that runs through a lot of cities. And I think what we're seeing, Phoenix as an example, is a kind of how unresilient, how unsustainable that model is. So now there's a big search for a new model, and part of that search is to actually go back to context to try to figure out how did we get here, and and what do we do? Because we are in the present, we can't completely undo where we are, but we can start to heal it. And I think urban acupuncture has that metaphorical idea about healing the city also and looking at it holistically.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about Phoenix through the lens of how a place like Phoenix evolves in the future. I mean, there's there's an interesting kind of dichotomy between the existence of Phoenix and newer technologies like the air conditioner or the car, which really centrally allowed Phoenix to become the, fifth largest, or maybe it's now fourth or third largest metropolis in the United States. And so I think in terms of scale, you're right, there's a difference between, the two case studies. But I think the idea that we think about this as a interface is really interesting to me as well, because it really is how to connect local individuals with information about their cities. So I think that's another interesting point to be made.
Well,
Uh,
we've kind of covered our second question here, which is why is Phoenix an interesting place to study? And
yeah,
I think it is. It raises the two basic conditions of hot, arid zones, right? Which is the summer heat spikes, which are getting worse, and chronic water shortages because the population is too much for the available water. Uh, Both of which are crimp growth. You can't just grow without confronting those two problems.
yeah, and especially I mean, the intense, heat here in Phoenix experienced over this last summer is a case in point for that. I mean, it's a survivability issue. It's a public health issue. It's all kinds of things wrapped into how we make a city like Phoenix more resilient in the future. And a lot of it does have to do with water and the kind of commonality of cities that grow near reliable bodies or sources of water. And I think that's, reconnecting to the kind of source of what it means to celebrate or to use effectively and efficiently resources like water, is central to how we might think about, I think, urban acupuncture, because it really is that resilience is tied into our direct connection to our experience of a natural landscape. And so that probably takes different forms in different cultures and things like that. But I think it's centrally humanistic to think about that, right? And it's a global problem. So the scale of it is enormous.
Well, there was an article that, the New York Times has a weekly science section, and yesterday, I don't know, whenever I read it recently, they were saying that the wet bulb temperature, which is the kind of the way the body measures humidity and temperature, that temperature is lower than they expected. And if you hit that temperature, then you can't actually survive. It's basically it'll kill you in a matter of hours. So this is not a trivial problem, actually, for a city, for all cities that fall in these hot, arid zones, that they're already facing summer temperatures which are very dangerous for people.
And I think
Um,
that's, and then John, I think that's why it folds back into the idea of morphology, actually, because the adaptations required maybe to make a city a desert metropolis or a desert city or desert urbanism effective in a kind of long-term, sustainable vision takes all kinds of forms and requires all kinds of different inputs from communities and you know, evaluating how really to implement some of the changes that we'd want to see, like access to. I know the city of Phoenix is doing some really amazing things. Actually, the access to chilled water. It's only exists downtown, but just public water sources, public amenities. They even make these cooling stations where people can go in the hottest time of the day to get refuge. Um, and so that's how intense the heat really is. It really is a major public health issue here in Phoenix. Something like 600 people die almost every summer here now
right.
without,
Yeah.
they don't know the effects of the heat or they're unhoused and exposed more than others would be. So, um, the housing part of the equation of urban morphology is a whole other conversation we could probably have. But um,
Yeah. I think I want to go back just briefly to the AI and data analysis part. I mean, I think we need to be clear that this is something we're experimenting with. Uh, uh, this is, despite all the hype, these are the early days of AI, actually, right? There's a lot of competing AI offers. They all have problems currently. However, they also have possibilities. And with Dr. Hassani, we're designing or putting together a design studio looking at Phoenix as the city in question, which would use AI and data analytics as a kind of a toolkit to see how we can apply it in an experimental way. I think, in terms of the conference in Tashkent, I think you should be aware, those of you at the conference, that anybody can play in this case, right? We're all kind of at the same level regarding the technology. And, you have the same possibility in virtually any city to start to explore these tools in the context of urban regeneration. I think that's an important point too, that urban morphology is joined at the hip with urban regeneration. It is an idea about making urban regeneration more responsive to the community the city serves, because most urban regeneration is top down. It's either directed by the government or it's directed by developers or both. It often excludes the community because it doesn't really know how to tap the community effectively. And one of the things we're looking at is whether social media and other forms of online discourse can actually be supported by AI, because AI has this possibility of summarizing discussion and tracking discussion, which was always the dream of people like Horst Riddle in Berkeley, who at the end of his life came up with a big idea about environmental planning, in which he thought maybe the computer could help. At the time he had that idea, the computer was not helpful, not strong enough. But Buckminster Fuller had the same idea with this kind of global support. Now we're probably at the cusp of the support they were thinking about 50 years ago or 40 years ago. So it's actually a very interesting moment. But for a place like Tashkent, you have the same possibility we do. It's the technology is kind of there. It's actually very accessible. And as you work on your studios and work on urban regeneration, you should play with it. That's what we're basically doing, is trying it out. Try it out. Share your results.
yeah, I think John, your point about
Could be
experimentation
interesting.
is a critical one. To kind of take on an experimental mindset and say, well, we may not know the result of what a certain project takes on or the scale of or scope of it, and there's certain things that maybe we wanted to find that we could use as a knowledge set, right, in interacting with AI. But I think you're right; it's a big moment for this kind of more open sourced approach to how to use tools like this effectively. So like you said, it's kind of a jump in and try it out.
There's also, I think the other message of the current moment, and this runs through all the efforts to make urban morphology actionable, is they all emphasize local community participation. And it's a kind of what we call in America local democracy, trying to empower communities to have a say about what happens to them, right? And also to change the urban regeneration focus from projects to a dialogue. Uh, and part of the idea in urban morphology is to actually have a kind of Wikipedia approach to the background information about context, so people understand more about their own community in a historically and as a place, as a climate. They're not just operating from ignorance. And currently, there is a kind of what Horst Riddle called a symmetry of ignorance between cities and local people, because cities are often not well informed about themselves either. It's so to get that urban morphology really says, no, you have to inform yourself, but it has lacked a way to do this. Now, maybe it has that way eventually.
I agree, John. I think it's just in the way that a neural engine might use a recursive process, let's say, to search through a data information set and look for patterns of information. We could take that as an analogy and use that to connect cities more holistically to their processes and institutions that really have the ability to have a large influence on some of these topics and issues, right? Maybe the last question to wrap up, John, would be how does a profession or professional know it's time to integrate a new technology into the service of their work?
Well, it's interesting. I edited the oral history of Chuck Davis, a California architect who actually designed Monterey Bay Aquarium and was a partner in a famous firm founded in the just after World War II. And he describes in that oral history uh, bringing the computer into his office and what a struggle it was. Some of his older partners were very, very resistant to this, but Chuck understood that the profession was changing and they had to jump in and do it. So they did. And and there was a couple of years of tension between him and his partners. I think that I think that now we're a little more um, generally tech savvy. The profession is more tech savvy than it used to be. But uh, but it takes, I think you have to remember that it takes, according to John Seeley Brown, who's a famous technology uh, expert, it takes a generation for technology to really become so embedded in our life that we take it for granted. I mean, think of the iPhone. The iPhone 2013, I think it. So it's now 10 years in, and even now we're thinking about alternatives, but we've also really learned how to integrate it with life for better and for worse. I mean, it has some downsides also. But I think any professional has to think about their career. Firms have to think about their future. Professionals have to think about their careers, which you typically span 40 years, 50 years, right? I mean, look at me, I'm 77. I worked for 5 decades, basically. And in that 5 decades, technology changed immensely.
That's a great.
And and it's still changing, and I'm just going with it. I mean, one of the reasons that Rocky and I and Dr. Hassani have become friends is that I think we all support each other in this transition. Uh, so the message I think is to stay open to and always look and see, often when they present a new technology, there's a fear factor, like AI. They're saying, oh, it may completely take us over, the machines may run our lives, et cetera. Well, okay, that's been said, since I was a kid. There's always a scare factor about new technology, but then actually the technologies are typically they're invented by humans and they're usually in the end can be used quite effectively by us. We're, we remain, most technology advances because of us, because of our using it. It doesn't advance itself. When they train AI on itself, it starts talking like a monkey. So I think we're still in the driver's seat, actually.
Yeah,
But you have to drive. You have to grab
yeah.
the wheel.
One step at a time. Yeah. Well, thanks, John. Very
Yeah,
productive conversation, and thank you all for tuning in.
yeah. Well, we should say that Dr. Hassani is our representative at the conference. We're sorry we can't be there in person, but here we are, and uh, have a good time. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Rocky.
Thank you,
Talk to
John.
you later.